Warning, 50 States, 50 Murders is a podcast based around true crime. Please be advised of the horrific details of murder, abuse, and sexual assault, occasional adult language, as well as brief humor. Buckle up and enjoy the ride.
Hello, and welcome back to 50 States, 50 Murders. I am your host, AJ.
And I am your co-host, Sarah.
This is the podcast taking you, the listener, on an auditory road trip across all 50 states while we discuss 50 different murders. Thank you all for tuning in to Season 2, Episode 24.
This week, we are heading to Russian Jack Springs Park, located in Anchorage, Alaska, to tell a tale of four friends camping on the deadliest night in Anchorage.
For this week's request, we were asked to cover the state of Alaska. And this week's recommendation comes to us from my very own wife, Alexis, a.k.a. Miss Rutledge. So thank you for the recommendation as well as the brand new pre-intro that we have on our episode. This is going to be a fun state to cover because for me personally, it is number one on my own bucket list for states to visit. Haven't been there yet, but it does reside at number one on my list personally. And for my co-host, Sarah, she's actually been lucky enough to already have visited Alaska in her life. So we have a case that I'm really looking forward to discussing. We're gonna learn a little bit about a mother who was aiming for a fresh start in the final frontier that is known as Alaska, as well as a story of four friends who decided to go camping at the wrong place at the wrong time. The story actually comes to us at a really great time because my co-host is potentially gearing up for a camping trip of her own. So I know Sarah's going to be excited for this one.
Yep.
Big camping trip, is that still the go?
Yep.
All right.
So far, so good.
All right.
Unfortunately, not in Alaska, but...
Not in Alaska, but that's okay.
Yep.
All right. So Alaska, its state nickname is the Last Frontier. And like Hawaii, Alaska is not part of the lower 48. Alaska is north of the lower 48 and to the west of Canada. Out of all 50 states, Alaska is USA's largest state. Something I thought was a little interesting. I guess as a kid, I always thought Texas was our biggest state. But I learned later, like in high school, I don't know if that's good or bad, but in high school I learned that Alaska is actually our biggest state. Not only is it our biggest state, but it's 3 times bigger than Texas. So, it's real big. Mm-hmm. Alaska was purchased from Russia for a grand total of $7.2 million. This just stood out to me. I thought this was crazy. 1867, we purchased Alaska, and $7.2 million. That's probably money that we'll never personally see, but I feel like in the grand scheme of things, that's not that much money.
That's what I was thinking when I saw that.
Now, if you adjust for inflation, that would be equal to $129 million. Again, I'll never see that much money, but still, it's not, I don't know. You see NBA, NFL players are getting that all the time. So to be able to purchase a landmass like Alaska for that much money is pretty crazy. And I wanted to look into a little bit further. If you took Alaska's current worth, they're estimated to be around $500 billion with a B.
So definitely a good purchase.
Yeah, pretty solid purchase for the old USA back in 1867. State sport is dog mushing. That's going to have your little huskies, and they're pulling the sleds. I don't know what the proper terminology is, but you know what it is. Alaska has the densest population in all 50 states. So I know we talked about this with Montana. Alaska's even more dense. They average one person per square mile. So if you took a location like Manhattan, New York, and then you equated Alaska's population density, that means there'd only be 16 people in Manhattan. Gun ownership, 65% of people in Alaska own guns. That's third to Montana and Wyoming at 66%. I think that's fair when you live in Alaska and there's polar bears. I almost feel like you have to have a gun on you for protection. I'd be afraid to leave the house without one on me. So that makes sense. I get that. And a weird law. It is legal to hunt bears in Alaska. However, it is illegal to wake a bear up to take a photo. Kind of weird.
Yeah. You can kill them, but don't take that photo.
Yeah, you could kill them, just don't disturb them. We have the Alaska state flag / seal. For me personally, we've been doing this for a little bit now. This is our 24th state. I don't know what it is, but I think this is my favorite flag thus far. I'm liking it. What do you think? It's simple, it's clean, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely simple, and it's clean. I like it. Looks good.
So the state flag of Alaska displays 8 gold stars. It's a blue flag, 8 gold stars, and it's forming the Big Dipper as well as Polaris on a dark blue field. The Big Dipper is an asteroid in the constellation Ursa Major, which symbolizes a bear indigenous to Alaska.
And we'll throw that on our TikTok for you guys, too.
Absolutely, it'll be on there. Murder per capita. I think when you have a population that has 65% of the people with guns, it's normal to have a higher rate up there. So Alaska comes in at 7th out of all 50 states, 9.5 murders per 100,000 people. Some top places to see. I kept this one short. I usually try to find like 3 top attractions or something that just looked interesting to me. But I'll be honest with you, every top tourist attraction in Alaska is a state park, which is awesome, and they're beautiful, but it isn't like the most entertaining on the podcast. So I'm going to give you one. The top spot is the Denali National Park. Denali features the tallest mountain in North America, not just United States, but all of North America. Denali Park as a whole is bigger than the entire state of New Hampshire. You have lots of mountains, lots of glaciers making up 16% of the park. So as far as beauty goes, Denali National Park is definitely a must-see in Alaska, as well as the other national parks. But to switch gears a little bit, since you have personally been to Alaska, instead of me reading off some things, maybe give us a quick rundown on your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2012, so coming up on 13 years, which seems a little bit crazy to me, me and my family took a cruise to Alaska, which I would 100% highly recommend, and also recommend getting a balcony room. It was super awesome to be able to wake up and go grab your breakfast and sit on the balcony and just kind of watch the scenery. It was super beautiful, and I 100% recommend. Also, you get to see a couple different areas of the state. So we did actually get to do the dog mushing.
Okay.
We also got to zip line on a rainforest in Alaska, which I thought was crazy.
Very cool.
And it was definitely a little bit of a different trip because typically when you leave Ohio, you hope to go to somewhere a little bit warmer, sunnier.
Yeah, warmer climate.
Of course. So we went in June,
Okay.
right before my birthday that year. And we went from weather that, in summertime in Ohio, it's about 75 to 85 degrees. In Alaska is typically from 40 to 60 degrees. So we definitely had to plan a little bit differently with going from summertime and warmer weather, 75, 80 degrees, going down to 40 to 60. So it was definitely an interesting time, but it was super cool to get to see different parts of Alaska.
Sure.
All in one trip, which was super awesome.
So that was just a quick rundown on the old Final Frontier. that is known as Alaska. Number one on my personal bucket list. We will, as always, bring it back around the horn at the end, and it's a little different on this one because you've already been there. But I'm still going to have you throw it on the overall list and see where you would put it at. Before we get into our specific case, as always, let's dive into 3 infamous murderers in the state that we're traveling to.
First up, we have Robert Hansen, a.k.a. the Butcher Baker. Popularly known as the Butcher Baker, Robert was an American serial killer active in Anchorage, Alaska. Between 1972 and 1983, he abducted, raped, and murdered at least 17 women. Many of the women abducted were released by Hansen into the wilderness and hunted with a Ruger Mini 14 and hunting knives. Sounds like a movie plot.
Yeah, I think I've seen a movie on this before, honestly.
Me too. Hansen was captured in 1983 and sentenced to 461 years imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He died in 2014 of natural causes at the age of 75.
Okay, so we got a guy that's capturing women, letting them run, and kind of just playing the hunter. Interesting start to Alaska, but also kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
I could see that.
Next up, we have Michael Silka, an American spree killer who is believed to have murdered 9 people in Alaska during May 1984, primarily in the small village of Manly Hot Springs. The spree ended in a shootout with Alaska state troopers in the Alaskan wilderness in which Silka was shot and killed. The motives for his actions remain unclear.
I feel like we've had quite a bit now where just no motive. And it just always kind of makes you wonder, like, what was the purpose, if any? I mean, it's just, I don't know, interesting.
Yeah, as humans, we always want to put a why.
Yeah.
A why to what happened, but honestly, I don't think some of these end in results of that why or closure, unfortunately. And next up, we have Thomas Bundy, which reading his name at first kind of tripped me up with Ted Bundy.
Yeah, not to be confused.
Just his name a little bit, not to be confused. Thomas Bundy, an American serial killer who, from 1979 to 1981, committed a series of murders of young women and girls in the city of Fairbanks, Alaska. At the time of the killings, Bundy was serving at the Ilsen Air Force Base near Fairbanks and for a long time avoided suspicion. Despite confessing to the crimes, Bundy was not immediately arrested due to a legal mistake and remained on the run for another 8 days until his apparent suicide in a motorcycling accident, during which, for unknown reasons, he did not make any effort to evade justice.
Okay, so kind of another one where you don't really know why it happened. He kind of just took himself out, which it's appreciated, I guess. People who are on a killing spree or committed some type of murder and then basically let go due to a mistake or some sort of exception. And that kind of runs true to today's case a tiny bit. Not to spoil anything.
Spoiler alert.
Surprisingly, not as many serial killers in Alaska as I thought there would have been. I thought I was going to have like a plethora to choose from. Not so much. It was slim pickings. Yeah, that's a little bit about Alaska. That's some infamous killers who reside in Alaska. And that's going to switch us over to our case of the week. And Sarah mentioned it at the top in our introduction. It's the deadliest night in Alaska. So to kick off this week's story, I'm going to rewind us back to the year 1977. Norma Thornton was a mother of 4 children, as well as a wife to her husband. Sadly, her husband passed away in 1977, leaving Norma and her 4 children looking for a fresh start. So something I found interesting about your life story, Sarah, not sure if you would necessarily call it starting over, maybe more so finding yourself. We all are born and raised here in the great state of Ohio. However, a little after high school, you specifically decided to spread your wings a little bit, leave the state, and maybe to help us get into the mind of someone who also left home, and kind of just see what else is out there, like Norma Thornton did. Tell us a little bit about your brief adventure, what that was like for you, and was this a means to start over, or was it always a plan to come back home?
That's definitely a couple different part question, but absolutely. I was working at the time. I was 20 years old. I was working at Longhorn Steakhouse, where I was a corporate trainer as a server as well. So I was kind of doing both. And honestly, we were just offered an opportunity to, use that corporate training experience that we had to travel to a different state. The idea was that they would give us, an allowance to pay for us to go and also give us an allowance to come back. But we had to stay for 6 months to get the store open, running, train the staff, just kind of be there as somebody who had already worked at that brand and train other servers. So we were offered to be able to make our own schedules, work as much as we wanted to. And honestly, it was almost like a rash decision. I was like, at the time, like I said, I was 20. I was kind of going through a bad breakup at the time with somebody who was in the military. I didn't have any children, obviously. And I'm like, what? Why not?
Yeah.
Like at the time, I think I want to say it was like either $1,000 or $1,500. And which isn't much today if you think about it and like think about our bills or anything. But 15 years ago at this point, that was a lot of money to me. And I was like, you know what? Why not? And I loaded up my 1998 Ford Contour and drove the 13 hours and had a roommate that I had known through friends who was, I want to say he was probably 8 years older than me, but the goal was I truly didn't have a goal. When I went there, I kind of, like I said, I mean, I have a lot of great friends here. I have my family here. I don't think I would have ultimately ended up in Nebraska. However, I think it was like a pivotal moment in that time frame for me to be able to be around new people and just like kind of get to know myself for the first time. And I truly would never, ever take back that experience. I 100% probably would have stayed even a little bit longer, but there were issues at home that I really wanted to take care of with my friends and family. So either way, I think it was pivotal, and I think I recommend it for everybody to do at least once in their life.
Okay. So yeah, taking a fresh start in Nebraska, did end up making it back home. And that kind of is where our story takes us. It's a wife and a mother who unfortunately lost her husband and decided it's time to just fresh start. Let's start over. And to do so, Norma decided to purchase an old school bus, turn it into a mobile home, and head to Alaska of all places for their fresh start. Now, if you were to go through a midlife crisis personally, do you think you could ever see yourself doing the van life?
Highly unlikely.
Okay.
To be honest.
See, we see stories about it all the time, and I always tell Alexis, like, man, I like envy people that can do that. I probably would hate it, but just to be able to go for it, I think there'd be some sort of freeing to it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I just also think, flashing back to 2 episodes ago in Montana.
Yep.
With your, just being in such a small, close environment with people for 10 days, imagine months. I just think that would be really hard, but I have seen on TikTok some things that make it look very appealing that they can do certain things with vans.
Yeah. There's some really nice there's a lot of different accounts on TikTok that probably make it look better than it really is. Norma's got a old school bus. She's taking her and her 4 kids up to Alaska, and they are going to restart life all over.
They did a lot of fishing, catching their dinners, as well as berry picking. Essentially, they were living off the land. Norma's oldest child, his name was VJ Sylvester. As the story of moving to Alaska progresses forward, it is 1982, and VJ had just turned 18 and wanted to be his own person. Sort of get out into the world and get to do his own thing. Or, long story short, he really wanted to move out.
Yeah, he just It's time to move out. I don't want to
Mhm.
live at home with my mom anymore. Yeah.
And
Okay.
his siblings. VJ Sylvester rented an apartment with his best friend Dean. Things were going all right at first, but as time progressed, they had to get more roommates to help financially, so it got to a point where it was too crowded. They then left the apartment. VJ is a kid who was leaving back on a school bus with 3 siblings and his mother. Now he was in an apartment with a bunch of people. So, feeling crowded, his next idea was for him and Dean to set up a tent at Russian Jack Springs Park. Russian Jack Springs Park was 300 acres in Anchorage, Alaska that was well visited and always had a lot of foot traffic.
Just from reading the story, you get a sense that VJ doesn't particularly enjoy small spaces. Understandably, you go from a bus to a small apartment, but to then move to a tent with another person, I kind of thought that was a little bit of an odd move.
Mm-hmm.
You clearly don't like to be in spaces with other people, so let's set up a tent. I mean, that's got to be the smallest space you could possibly do. They're living this next chapter of their lives, camping in the wild of Alaska, and pretty much just seeing where their life takes them.
And while Alaska is known for being a cold state, the first thing people think of when Alaska is mentioned is the cold temperatures, you know, with all the ice and snowfall they have there. But keep in mind that though they're living in a tent, this is the summertime. So temperatures were a bit warmer.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, not super warm,
Mm-hmm.
but, you know, you could see 50 to 60.
Yeah, it's definitely warm for Alaska, we should say.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much daylight 24 hours a day. In the winter, you have total darkness, and then in the summer, you almost get no darkness.
I'm just kind of curious, you know, I wonder what kind of effects that would have on your, if you
Sleeping
live,
schedule?
yeah, in Alaska, like what your mental state would be. I mean, I'd have to assume you get used to it, but that would be a really hard thing to adjust to, for sure. Our guy VJ, he was in a new relationship with his girlfriend Stephanie. The date is May 3rd, which is just one day before Stephanie's 17th birthday. Now, the plan was for VJ and Stephanie to go to the movies. They weren't sure if they were going to see each other the following day, which was the day of her actual birthday, so they wanted to be sure to at least spend this day together. Now, as we mentioned, VJ is living in a tent with his buddy Dean, so naturally, Dean's just kind of already there. So to help make things just a little less awkward, Stephanie decided that she would bring her best friend Amber along. So now we have 4 teens hanging out in the summer of Alaska with not too many worries in the world.
Later that same day, around 8:10 p.m., calls began to the 911 operators that there were shots in Russian Jack Springs Park. Keep in mind, even though it's 8 p.m., again, it's daylight. And just like last week's case, where we had a perp stalking a mother and child at a heavy populated location, Russian Jack Springs Park was a very active and well-visited park. You had just 6 months of darkness, so people are eager to get outside and enjoy sunshine, hiking, walking their dogs. So shots being fired in such a populated area was pretty alarming to everyone.
Yeah, no, I get that. You got people who have been inside all winter long, looking forward to getting out there. So Russian Jack Springs Park was a park that got a lot of foot traffic. This wasn't a place where, you know, it's not an extremely isolated place by any means. So police arrived to the park, and they come across a body, one of the 4 teens who were hanging out enjoying their day in the park. Then, one by one, they continued to come across all 4 bodies. Basically, it's just a staggered trail of teenagers who had been shot point-blank range. The 2 boys suffered single gunshot wounds to the back of the head. The 2 girls, a single shot to the face. Now, 2 of the 4 teens were dead upon arrival. However, 2 were left clinging to life. They were rushed to the hospital. Hopes were not high, but the idea was to at least be able to get an opportunity to ask if they could ID the shooter. Sadly, this opportunity did not come, and the other 2 passed away shortly after being rushed to the hospital. We now had 4 teens who had been shot and killed May 3rd, 1988 in the city of Anchorage, Alaska. VJ, Dean, Stephanie, and Amber.
Keep in mind, this is back in the late 80s in Alaska, as we mentioned, which is the densest population of any state in America. So naturally, the police force is not the largest. There was a 25-man investigation team put together to work on figuring this all out. Calls were made to the day shift detectives as well as officers from outside towns to help make this happen.
Okay, so we have all hands on deck. Probably, I would have to imagine, just a lot of scrambling going on. That's probably not something that happens a lot in the city of Anchorage, Alaska. So things already seem a bit hectic. You have 4 victims shot point blank range with a killer on the prowl. But we have a little extra spice to today's story. This day specifically is recognized as the deadliest night in Anchorage. 4 murder victims in one single night. It is certainly tragic, but for this to be the most deadly night in the town's history, I think we're going to need just a few more victims, and that's exactly what we're getting. So while police are assessing the chaos of the Russian Jack Springs Park murder, scrambling to get a team together, 2 of the teens being rushed to the hospital before passing, more calls begin ringing in through 911 dispatch. Another shooting.
Less than 5 miles down the road from the park is the Black Bull Tavern. It's a little dive bar that was a local hangout for the residents in town. Police arrived on the scene to this separate location, and the first thing they notice is 2 bodies on the floor. 1 man and 1 woman. A few feet away from these 2 bodies was another man lying on the floor. All 3 dead on arrival. So for the listeners at home keeping score, we now have 7 murder victims. 4 teenagers, 3 adults, 4 men, and 3 women. Same town, same day, all gunshot wounds to the head. It makes sense why May 3rd is in fact the deadliest night in Anchorage, Alaska history.
Okay, so quick little timeout. Not necessarily related to the case, but I do feel like this was definitely worth mentioning before we move on. Researching this case, listening to some podcasts, watching a documentary, the deadliest night in town history. Police walk into the Black Bull Tavern, little dive bar. It's Anchorage, so I'm sure there's not really a lot to do in town. So yeah, let's head to the local bar. There's 3 dead bodies on the floor, and that wasn't even the weirdest thing that they saw when they walked in. The patrons of the tavern remained sitting at their seats, drinking their drinks, and conversing with one another. So maybe, just maybe, the vibes were just absolutely immaculate that day. I don't know, but I have to imagine, just me, myself, being out at a bar, having some drinks. If there were 3 people behind me who were shot and killed, I got to imagine that would be a buzzkill. I think that would be enough for me to maybe call it a night. But nonetheless, yeah, they're just all hanging out, just having a good old time.
Yeah, I'm not usually the one to call the party early, but I think if there was a shooting and 3 bodies laying on the floor behind me, I think I would be ready to back up and go.
Yeah, a couple gunshot wounds. It's probably time to call an Uber. I think that's fair.
Absolutely.
First assessment, you now have twice as many victims as well as 2 different crime scenes. However, on the positive, this gives detectives more to work with. You have more clues, more evidence, more eyewitnesses, since everyone wanted to hang around after the shooting to interview, and help put the pieces of the puzzle together. Same day, same time, same style like you mentioned, just 5 miles apart. The incidents at both the park and the tavern certainly had to be related, but why? What was the motive, the reasoning for these killings? Did Anchorage have a mass shooter on their hands? Could this be someone going mad from 24 hours of nonstop sunlight? Where could their killer be? And would there be any more bodies before this bright, sunshiny night came to a close?
Since everyone at the Black Bull Tavern was kind enough to stick around throughout what was taking place behind them, police figured there was no better place to start than with the eyewitness interactions of what took place there. They essentially got the same story from everyone they interviewed. A younger guy came into the bar to find his ex-girlfriend talking to an older guy. The younger guy left, went out to his car, came back with a gun. He shot his ex-girlfriend and decided, why not shoot the man that she was talking to?
Yeah.
I mean, makes sense.
Yeah, why not? Might as well. We're already here.
Top it off, he decided to end the night by taking his own life, leaving us with 3 victims in total.
Okay.
So if there's any positive to take away from all of this, a little bit of, silver lining, This murder ended in suicide, which means that there is not a serial killer on the loose. That would have to bring some sort of relief, but the question still remains, what about the teens in the woods?
As the dust settles, or the gunpowder, we run into our first setback of this case. Police begin working on establishing a timeline of events, and they go back to timestamps made to 911. It had been determined that the park shooting happened almost an hour after the murder-suicide at the bar. So if you're wondering how these lines got crossed, keep in mind that this was 1988. This is going to be pre-cell phones. So for someone to report the crime in the woods, you got to run out of the woods. It's a 300-acre park. Probably get in a car. Probably drive to the closest business establishment. Jump on the phone and make the call and such. So I think for the timelines to get crossed, I guess that makes a little bit more sense. The problem is, obviously, if the murder-suicide happened prior to the shooting at the park, then that means two things. One, the two shootings are a complete coincidence and have actually nothing to do with one another. And two, we still have a killer on the loose.
The bar shooting was determined to be an ex-boyfriend in the act of a jealous rage. This incident could be more so put behind them and just refocus their energy back to the 4 teens. VJ, Dean, Stephanie, and Amber murdered at Russian Jack's Springs Park. Our next issue in this case is that there really wasn't any physical evidence on scene and no eyewitnesses who saw the shootings as they happened. But police knew they had to be quick to prevent this from getting any deadlier than it already was.
Our first break in the case comes as police began interviewing parkgoers who happened to be there the day of. As we mentioned, it's a heavy populated park. No one happened to actually be present at the scene of the shootings, but there were plenty of people at the park. So they happened to come across a man who saw a brand new bike resting against a tree. Unfortunately for the killer, this guy used to work at a bike shop, and he's pretty much just a bicycle expert. He told police that just from looking at the bike, he knew for a fact that the bike was pearl blue. Not sky blue, not dark blue, it was pearl blue. And it was easy to see that this was not your ordinary 26-inch frame bike. No, it was a specialized 27-inch frame bike. As he was looking at the bike, he got spooked as he noticed a man in the bushes watching him.
With 4 dead, the best lead that police had at that time was a tall white male with dark hair. As you can imagine, this profile could fit quite a lot of different people in Alaska. But perhaps that pearl blue bike with a 27-inch frame could play a part in solving this crime.
Tall white male with dark hair. I feel like that's pretty common in Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to imagine that's going to be a pretty large part of your demographic. With not a whole lot more to go off beyond that, at the time, police decided to continue reaching out to the public for help. They asked for any tips to call in, which, as you can imagine, led to many calls, over 100. I've never personally worked a tip line, but I do have to imagine that there are probably quite a bit of unhelpful calls, to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely. However, these tip lines do solve crimes, which is why they put them out there. And for this case, that's how they got their next big break. A call came in from a friend of Amber's. Amber, being of the 4 teens murdered at the park, the caller suggested that they take a closer look at Rick Larkin. He was younger, but he was a taller, white male, dark hair, and most importantly, he was Amber's ex-boyfriend. We had already one murder scene resulting from a jealous ex-boyfriend in a rage. Perhaps now we have 2.
We talked quite a bit in season 1 about how for many murder cases, it's usually the partner or the ex-partner, the husband, the wife, it's always going to be that person that they're in a relationship with. To make matters worse for Rick, he had a history of violent offenses. Also, like 65% of Alaska's population, Rick happened to carry a gun. From this one call to the tip line, you have a suspect with potential motive, a past, as well as someone who's known to carry.
And not to pile on Rick here, but it's worth mentioning that he drove a van. Through several different interviews from park goers, there was a van in the parking lot the day of the shootings. If you're thinking it can't get a whole lot worse for Rick, it can. The tipster lastly informed police that he happened to get into an altercation with VJ, another one of the 4 teens, just days before the murder. When factoring in the vehicle as well as connection to 2 of the 4 victims, police prioritized Rick as suspect number 1. Luckily for the police, he happened to have a warrant out for parking violations that made bringing him in pretty easy.
Jumping back to our Montana case a few weeks ago, remember when Diego was brought in for questioning? What was the thing about him that immediately stood out and made him suspicious to police?
The cuts on his face and his hands.
Exactly. And wouldn't you know it, our guy Rick had several abrasions on his hands, leading police to ask about the cuts and where they came from. Now, this did set Rick back a little bit. What did cuts on his hand have to do with traffic violations? Which is the reason for him being here after all, right? The line of questioning caused him to go silent and refuse to talk any further without a lawyer present.
Which this pretty much puts the case on hold, with their one and only suspect refusing to talk. They went back to a piece of information they received earlier and decided to lean on that a little bit more. That pearl blue bicycle.
The pearl blue bike.
Detectives decided to give the call to a manager of the local bike shop in town. He did recall selling a pearl blue bike 2 months prior. This sale stood out to him for a few reasons. For one, the purchase was made in the colder months prior to bike season.
Okay.
2, he needed a slightly larger frame than normal.
Ooh, maybe a 27-inch frame.
27 instead of 26. And lastly, he requested a few items to be included, one of which was a bike bell, which to the manager was odd for an adult male, but nonetheless he proceeded. The manager was able to go into his records and find the receipt for this bicycle purchase. With the receipt there included an end user's address, 2900 Providence Drive, Anchorage, Alaska.
Now, you would think that this is a huge lead in the case, right? A physical address to lead them back to the owner of that pearl blue bike that was spotted in the park the same day as the murders. Unfortunately, not so much. Police immediately recognized the address and assumed it was just someone either trying to be funny or someone using a phony address. 2900 Providence Drive was the location of Alaska Psychiatric Institute, also known as API. Now, could this potentially be Rick Larson using a fake address when purchasing his new bike? Detectives decided to visit API off this information regardless. They're at a dead end, might as well. During the visit, it was revealed that the bike in question did not, in fact, belong to Rick. That is because the bike in question, the 27-inch pearl blue bike with a bell, happened to be registered to a patient at API, Charles Meach. Coincidentally, Charles Meach, if you had to guess, tall or short?
Tall.
Tall white male with dark hair.
This was enough to lead police to look into Charles Meach, just to dot their I's and cross their T's. Meach came to Alaska in 1973. You could say he was also looking for a fresh start in the final frontier, as he was running away from his troubles with alcohol and drug-related offenses. For what it's worth, Meach was described by many others at API as the most sane patient on site.
That's quite a compliment. At a psych ward, but you just happen to be, hey, you're the most sane person here.
Yeah.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
You're the best of the worst.
Yeah, thank you. All right, cool.
Police decided to sit down with Charles Meach to ask him about the park murders. He was quick to inform police it could not have been him. When asked how he could be so sure, it's because he knew for a fact that he was inside of API the day of.
Yeah, I mean, that's the line of questioning, I guess, for me, off rip, doesn't make sense. He is at the psychiatric ward. How could he be anywhere other than the psych ward? Nonetheless, as it stands, police now have 2 suspects. You have Rick Larkin, who is Amber's ex-boyfriend, and refusing to speak. You also have Charles Meach, who's said to be a model patient at the local psych ward. With Rick remaining silent, police continue digging into Charles Meach. When it comes to psych wards, there's pretty much two ways in. Either you go in voluntarily for help, or it could be a means for a punishment. Perhaps you're a criminal but deemed insane, and rather than going to prison, you're placed in a psychiatric ward. What caught police's attention is that Charles Meach was here for that latter option.
In March of 1973, the same year he arrived in Alaska, he met a 22-year-old box boy at a grocery store in Anchorage. He was able to convince the box boy to join him, and they headed to a local park down the road. At the park is where he beat the 22-year-old to death with his fist and his feet. When asked why he killed him, Charles Meach said that his voice just annoyed him.
Okay.
He pled guilty to the murder, but before sentencing, psychiatrists diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. He was found not guilty by reason of mental insanity and sent to a mental institution in California.
Now, going back to our first suspect, Amber's ex-boyfriend Rick. At the station, he eventually opened up and broke his silence. He noticed a different officer who he recognized walking by, and he felt comfortable enough to speak with him specifically. He said he was only being quiet initially because the first officers just made him mad with their questions. He answered all the questions, explained where he was, what he was doing the day of, and honestly, everything checked out. Rick was cleared and allowed to leave, leaving Anchorage PD with just one suspect, Charles Meach.
So, rewinding back to Charles Meach being sent to a mental institute in California for a murder that he committed in Alaska, he was obviously a master manipulator. He was smart enough to beat the system. Meach would tell the doctors exactly what he believed that they wanted to hear. He would tell them how he was feeling just so great and doing so much better. With the doctors impressed at his so-called recovery at the California Mental Institute, they figured it would be a great time to send him back to Alaska, which is how he landed at API.
Yeah, hey, crazy guy who killed someone for having an annoying voice. You're doing a lot better. We're going to send you back to where you came from. Okay. Surprise, surprise, while at API, he continued to keep getting better. He learned from his time in California it was better to never disclose his dark thoughts and never discuss the voices that he heard in his head. Internally, it was chaotic all the time. He was right where he needed to be. But he was smart enough to never let that show to anyone on the outside of his own head. He had a very high IQ of 120 and was easily capable of tricking doctors. There was one doctor, however, at API who he could not fool, and this was Dr. Robinson. He was also the superintendent at API. He was aware of Meach and deemed him as the most dangerous man at API. So you have someone who is recognized as the most sane person by most, but the superintendent is deeming this person as the most dangerous man at API.
Most sane and most dangerous.
Yeah. It was documented by Dr. Robinson that he should never be allowed to leave.
So now we have one suspect who was cleared and allowed to leave, and another suspect who was in a psych ward and documented that he should not be allowed to leave. So how could Charles even be a suspect at all? The problem is, just 2 months after Dr. Robinson stated his concerns, he left API. Once Dr. Robinson was gone, Charles Meach was granted leave privileges. So this is a guy who murdered another human because he just had an annoying voice, and he is now allowed to leave 10 hours a day every day. With these leaves he was free to go wherever he wanted and do whatever he wanted to do without any supervision, just as long as he returned back to API every day.
Okay, so we have someone who is deemed the most dangerous person on site. That doctor who cleared this information left, and it sounds like they kind of fell back on to him being the most sane person. So they're like, yeah, 10 hours a day, do what you want, just make sure you're back at night. So quickly recalling back to season 1, Dakota and I were able to get into a gun control discussion. What I find really interesting about murders is that every case is unique and literally case-by-case basis. With the topic of murder, you can dive into a lot of pretty interesting, deeper issues, such as the one we had last week regarding Cheshire Police and the 911 operators.
Mm-hmm.
Did they act quick enough? Were they urgent enough? And you can certainly open a can of worms with talking mental illness, the definitions, especially when seeking punishment.
I think it brings up the point, though, that regardless, like in our last case, they were going to get into the house.
Yeah.
Whether it was through an unlocked door or breaking out a window while the parents slept, they were going to get into the house to get what they needed to get. So
yeah.
It's the same with it's very similar with the gun issue that we have. They're going to obtain the guns.
Yes,
where they
absolutely.
need to.
So I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer to these questions, but it is always a fascinating dive to just openly discuss and at times play devil's advocate. Something about this story that drew me back to season 1, when Dakota and I discussed gun control, we both agreed that while something needs to be done, I think we can all agree on that. But what that something is, I mean, neither of us had any clue, and we were both really thankful that that's not our job to come up with the solution. Reason I'm bringing this all up, well, we mentioned that unfortunately at the end of the day, no matter what restrictions you put in place, as you just said, there's just too many avenues to get a gun. If you absolutely want a gun bad enough, you're going to get a gun.
If you're a felon, a murderer, or deemed mentally insane, of course you cannot buy a gun legally. But Charles Meach was able to purchase 2 guns through classified ads in the newspaper. Having to return back to API every night, he couldn't keep the guns on him. So he went to Rush and Jack Springs Park and buried them there. Knowing he could not buy ammunitions for the guns, he paid a stranger $20 for bullets to his guns. So naturally, API keeps a log of their patients who are allowed to leave, when they return, and when they come back. So it would be easy enough to check these records and cross-reference May 3rd. And he was out about the time of the murders. Oddly enough, when the nurse left the room, Meach began to show some concerns to the police. He leaned forward and asked if the detectives could keep a secret. He informed them that on May 3rd, he was in fact out during the day, but it's because he went to have some drinks. He asked the detectives to keep that secret as he was not allowed to drink at all, given his past with alcoholism. Police asked if he knows why they were here, and he said something about those kids in the park. Wasn't a pretty sight, was it, while smiling.
As you can imagine, just 3 days later, Charles Meach admitted to the murders. He confessed these crimes to a psychiatrist. On the morning of the murders, May 3rd, he woke up to a bad day. You could say he woke up on the wrong side of the bed. This is someone who kept their room very neat and tidy, and he noticed that he had a brand new shirt that was now missing. Assumingly, someone must have stole it from him. He told the psychiatrist that he made it his mission to get even, to get revenge. Basically, to steal something of someone else's. Eye for an eye, or eye for a life. The day of the murders, he went out on leave on his pearl blue bike, bells and all. He stopped by the Wild Cherry and shared a picture with some guys there. If you had to take a guess, Wild Cherry, what do you think that would be?
Strip club.
Oh, strip club, okay. He tried getting touchy with the dancer, and when she pushed him away, it was his breaking point. I mean, wrong side of the bed, his shirt got stolen, now the stripper's denying him of his advances. Yeah, that was it. That was a snapping point for our guy.
So he hopped back on his bike, and he rode to the park and grabbed his gun. His adventure led him to VJ and Dean's tent, and no one was around, so he helped himself to the tent. Remember, the plan was to steal from someone just as someone has stole from him. While he was in that tent, VJ walked up and caught him in the act. Charles did not plan on murdering anyone necessarily, but he pulled out his gun, and when the teen began running away, he chased and fired. At this point, with the deed already done, he began picking the teens one by one until all 4 were shot. After the 4 shots, he planted the gun back in its hiding spot, hopped on his bike, and returned back to API as if it was just a normal day. Charles was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. During the trial, he pled not guilty, and as you probably guessed it, by reason of insanity. However, he would not be so lucky this time. Meach was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to 396 years in prison. Charles Meach died of natural causes in 2004.
While this is probably more so common sense than anything else, there is something positive that came out of all of this. This case of Charles Meach and the deadliest night in Anchorage influenced Alaska to change their laws. A criminally insane person deemed healthy while institutionalized now must serve the remainder of their sentence behind bars. So basically, if you are deemed insane, you go to a psych ward, and you're able to fool the doctors that you're all better, rather than just letting you out on leave or letting you go home. I mean, that's fine that you're better. Now you just got to serve the rest of your time in prison. Kind of feel like that's how it should have always been to begin with. Obviously, you're never excited when a person you love is murdered, but I couldn't imagine the rage I would feel if I lost someone close to me, and Absolutely. It was just because the state thought, hey, he's better, he's fine. Someone who killed someone because they had an annoying voice is probably someone who would kill again if given the opportunity. It's positive that the laws changed and that this won't happen again in Alaska, but big reason why I picked this case was I just thought that was so fascinating that they could just let him out for 10 hours a day with no supervision to go to the strip club, the Wild Cherry, go to the bar, do whatever he wanted. Deadliest night in Anchorage, our guy Charles Meach. Throwing it back to you, Sarah. We recapped the state of Alaska. I know you've personally been here yourself. Talked about Denali National Park. Didn't talk about too much more other than that, but number 1 on my list personally. I'll throw it back to you. I want to know, even though you've already been there, where are we putting this 1 through 50 on desired states to visit?
I honestly forget what the list is now, but I would probably put it at like 10 or 11.
Okay.
I mean, it's definitely still going to be high up there. I think, like I said, I think taking a cruise is a really good route to take here. And I would absolutely do it again, no questions asked.
All right. So as we begin our departure from the state of Alaska, the final frontier, in conclusion of episode 24 of 50 States, 50 Murders, we want to continue to thank you, the listener, for tuning in each and every week while we continue covering a new state as well as a murder case that happened to take place there.
If you've not already, please be sure to follow and subscribe. We are on Spotify, TikTok, and now YouTube. And be sure to tune in next week for episode 25, where we're going to take you back to my start over state of Nebraska.